is a great problem with people being put out of work because of the Industrial Revolution. All kinds of industries are collapsing, driving people out of the country into the cities to get whatever jobs they can. That is not working well for families. It's not working well for society in general, even in North America. Welcome to this very special episode of 18th Century Cooking. Today we're going to be talking about the poor and how to feed the poor in this time period of the 18th century, and specifically the 1790s and about 1800. In this time period, there is a real problem with supplying just normal people with bread. There's a crop failure in the late 1790s in Great Britain, and there's a great problem with feeding just everyday common people on the street. There are bread riots, there are all sorts of things, and there's a desire within all of the society to fix this problem, and many people wrote about it. We have this wonderful little piece from Hannah More, and she writes this small little pamphlet-y book called The Cottage Cook. So Ryan's been cooking up this soup out of this book. Let me read to you the recipe. So you think that this book is actually a cookbook. Now, it does have recipes in it, but it's only got like 4 recipes, and they're all almost the same thing. Let me read to you recipe number 3. That's the one we're making today. Take 2 pounds of salt beef or pork, cut it into very small bits, and put it into a pot with 6 quarts of water, and let it boil on a slow fire for 3/4 of an hour, and then put a few carrots, parsnips or turnips, all cut small, or a few potatoes sliced, a cabbage, or a couple of cresses. Thicken the whole with a pint of oatmeal, all of these to be well seasoned with salt and pepper. The other recipes are actually almost exactly the same thing in this cookbook, and this type of recipe is mentioned over and over in this time period. Why? There's no bread in this. There's no grain that needs to be given to this particular situation. The poor in the late 18th century, they survived on bread and small beer. That's it. And there was this, since wheat was so expensive, they had to come up with other means. And these people in the upper parts of society said, how can we help the poor people eat? How can we give them different options for eating bread? There were other options for bread specifically, and they talked about these in a time period, making bread with other things than wheat, making bread with rye, making bread with oats or barley, or even peas and beans, making bread that was not very good, even distasteful, and the common people rejected that bread. They did not want to eat it. They wanted to eat white bread. So let's set the stage for what's happening in the late 18th century in Great Britain. There is a great problem with the Industrial Revolution is basically coming into this time period, and a lot of people are being thrown out of work. A lot of cottage industries like weaving and spinning are being taken up by machines, and people are leaving the countryside and they are going to the cities. And there's a great increase in low-income people in these urban situations. And then we have on top of that all these crop failures and other problems. So there's a great amount of stress on lower income people here in Great Britain and even in North America in this time period. There's also a great desire to have people not cook their food the wrong way. So even during the Revolutionary War and in this time period, there's a desire that if people get meat, they should not roast it. They shouldn't fry it on the fire, but in fact make soup with it, because it's the most efficient way to get the most nutrition out of a piece of meat. So this is from The Soldier's Friend. And this is a little pamphlet right here from the time period, 1798. And it's for officers to help their military soldiers under their command eat properly, and many other things. He says, nothing is so agreeable and at the same time so wholesome to a soldier after a fatiguing and perhaps a wet march as some warm soup. To To boil the meat is therefore the mode of cooking which ought to be the most generally used in the army. There's even almost commands from the upper parts of the military down to the lower officers telling them to not let their soldiers fry the meat, that you should only give them the equipment so that they can boil the meat or they can make soups and stews, because it's the most efficient way to feed these soldiers. In this late 18th century time period, there's also the creation of soup kitchens, or as they call them in this book, soup shops, that are popping up in London, and they want to be able to feed poor people. They don't necessarily give away the soup, they charge a small amount for it, and the amount that they isn't covered by what they're charged is actually covered by a subscription by other people in that community. But they're reaching out. They want to feed as many people as possible. We've got this wonderful recipe for this soup kitchen in Birmingham. This is outside of London, obviously. 80 pounds of beef, shoulder, bosom, sticking pieces with 3 oxes' melts or lungs, given in by the butchers and weighing about 16 pounds. So something like 96 pounds of meat. Also, 4 legs of beef weighing 34 pounds, 3 ox cheeks weighing 27 pounds, and then added to that, 37 quarts of white peas, 21 pounds of onions, 48 pounds of ground rice, 12 pounds of salt, 6 ounces of black pepper, 2 ounces of ground ginger, and just a half ounce of cayenne pepper. Also, mint, celery, carrots, or leeks are often given as presents to sort of fill out this. Now, they would make these huge batches. This batch here would make 160 gallons of soup, and they go through and give you exactly what it would cost to make this 160 pounds or 160 gallons of soup. Even a recipe like this, isn't it interesting that in 160 gallons, they still put in the spices like a half ounce of cayenne. They want these, they still want there to be some flavor in this basically very inexpensive watery soup. And they would sell, or somebody would sort of buy a subscription to this for a small amount. Each week, each day, they could come in and get, say, a half a gallon of soup and feed their entire family. Maybe there would be some liquid allowance to this too, either small beer or something like it, and possibly a small loaf of bread. And so in the cities, people could still eat well even for a very small amount of money. A great example of someone in this time period is the author of this Cottage Cook, which is Hannah More. And she's writing hundreds of small pamphlets, helping out people with different ideas. Sometimes they're moralistic teachings, sometimes they have a religious bent to them, but she has a real heart for what's happening with these people in the lower part of society. She really wants to help them out as best she can, and the whole beginning part of this is a little story about a woman who didn't feel like she had enough money to really help out people. And Hannah More kind of goes through the steps of what somebody can do, even if they don't have a lot of funds. They can really help people out by teaching them how to cook or teaching them other things. So there's a lot going on in this time period. The people in the upper parts of society aren't necessarily saying, oh, poor people, you know, there's nothing we can do about it. They definitely want to reach down and help out the poorer parts of society right here in the late 18th century. Definitely probably a change from what was happening earlier on in the 18th century. So let me read to you this little section from The Cottage Cook, or Showing the Way to Do Much with Little Money, right here at the end of the main story. She's talking to someone and she says, "You have taught me that much good may be done with a little money, and that the heart and the head and the hands are of some use as well as the purse." So there's Mrs. Jones in this story, learning about what she can do. And again, you can almost connect right back with the Christmas Carol and Scrooge. There was Scrooge, and he was very, very well-to-do. He wasn't really doing anything with his money, but he had a lot of money. People came to him and said, hey, how can you help out the poor? And he asks immediately, what about the workhouses? What about the poorhouses? Aren't they doing the right thing? And here in this book, they're definitely saying, how can we help out the poor without sending them to those very places? The poorhouse, the workhouse in the late 18th century England were very, very difficult places. They made them that way on purpose. They didn't want people to stay there. They didn't want people to live in the poorhouse forever. And so they made it a very, very dismal existence. These works are meant to keep people out of those very places. How can we help out the poor?
Yo, dickhead. Hear me, dickhead?
What's good?
Yeah, you got ammo for Uzi?
I ain't got shit, bro.
Huh?
New to the city.
You new to the city?
Yeah, man. Shit.
Yo, Miss Man.
Yes,
Man.
yes.
I know you got right. So yo, I ain't gonna lie, you got some ammo for Uzi?
Yo, excuse me, sir.
What's
Excuse
up?
me, sir. So I have a question. This
Yeah.
guy, I'm pretty sure he's a criminal. He gave me like 3 switches, but like, how do I up my shit, twin, so I can hit that brr? You know?
You gave you a
How
switch?
do I throw 10? Yeah, I got a switch. How do I up my shit?
On what? What kind of switch?
That doesn't matter. But how do I up my shit?
About it.
How do I up my shit?
I don't know, bro. I'm new to the city, man.
Oh my fucking god.
Oh my fucking god.
Shut
Yo,
the
how do
fuck
I up my switch, twin?
Bro, you are literally going up to like the newbiest players asking, oh my god. Some people are not very smart, I swear. What the fuck happened
did you
here,
say?
guy?
Yeah, VIP. Yeah, what did you say?
Hey, bro, you new too,
Tem que
bro?
abaixar o Discord, velho. Discord é bom.
Yeah,
Você fraga Discord?
Man.
Huh?
I'm about to steal a car.
This is it. See that?
Fuck.
Wow. Big place wonder.
So here it is, the soup right out of the cottage cook. Ryan, what did you think about the recipe?
It's really straightforward. It's really simple. There were a lot of root vegetables that you could use, and I just decided to use them all because we
Right.
have them all.
A little bit of everything.
Yeah, right.
Also, I mean, I think the special thing is the oatmeal that comes in at the end.
Right.
That
Thickens
thickens
it
it
right
up.
up.
Right.
Yep.
I wouldn't complain about this
No,
anytime.
it's interesting. The texture is almost like when you thicken something with flour.
Right. The oatmeal does an excellent job of thickening this up so that it isn't a super thin soup.
Right.
One of the references actually complained. I think it was the College of Physicians.
Okay.
They were saying, oh, a liquid food doesn't work in your stomach. They said, oh, the stomach acids turn it into solids, and only then can you digest it. Which now, of course, we think is pretty silly.
Yes.
But this thickening of the soup was an important part of that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's definitely hearty. There's a lot going on in here. So it's got carrots, it's got turnips. I think the parsnips really come through, that sweetness from the parsnips.
Yeah.
And then there's really only, I mean, compared to everything else, there's only a little bit of meat.
True.
But you cut it small enough that it, it fills it out.
Yeah,
So-
that's the whole idea of cut it really small.
Right.
In that particular recipe, it talked about salt beef. You used fresh beef, which
did.
is fine, but salt beef would have been an inexpensive meat that they could have gotten any time of the year.
I think when you cut the cabbage up really small, that really helps to fill it up too. You never have a bite that feels empty or brothy, right? There's always something there.
But it's not all greens. You have this. If you have the big pieces of greens in there, it's hard to work around. But in this way, it fills it up. It gives you the nutrition of the greens without the troublesome big leaves in there.
Plus the greens, you really don't, it's not like a beef broth. This is like a vegetable, it tastes like a vegetable broth. There's enough cabbage and the parsnips and the carrots really coming through. And then there's body from the potatoes. It's just good overall.
So I read that giant recipe from the soup kitchen one, right?
Yeah.
With the 80 pounds. Their instructions were to actually cook those meats in a digester or pressure cooker so that it turned everything into a broth. I am so glad we tried this recipe. It has an amazingly rich history, an important history. Let me read to you the final paragraphs from The Cottage Cook. This is the friendly hints at the very end. The difference between eating bread new and stale is 1 loaf in 5. If you turn your meat into broth, it will go much further than if you roast it or bake it. If you have a garden, make the most of it. A bit of a leek or an onion makes all dishes savory at small expense. If the money spent on fresh butter were spent on meat, poor families would be much better fed than they are. If money spent on tea were spent on home-brewed beer, the wife would be better fed, the husband better pleased, and both would be healthier. Keep a little Scotch barley, rice, dried peas, and oatmeal in the house. They are all cheap and don't spoil. Keep also pepper and ginger. Pay your debts, serve God, love your neighbor, the end. If you want more information on the lives...
When we're studying the lives of people in the 18th century, it is rather easy to research someone who is rich or important. If we want to know something about George Washington, there are reams of data about George Washington. Letters he's written, people wrote letters about him, there are paintings. There's all this information about somebody like a George Washington in history. But it gets much more difficult when we're trying to understand the lives of ordinary people in the 18th century, or even more difficult, poor people in the 18th century. So one of the places we can go is travel journals, and we get people describing their travels in the 18th century, and there are
Would we be able to survive in early America? If we were transported back in time, would we be able to make it? Here on the channel, we focus on the 18th century. We study what they're eating and the people and their lives and how they live. And that challenges us as we live here in modern times. And we say, could we live in those times? They had a very, very difficult life. Death was surrounding them at all times. There were a lot of different challenges that they were up against. Here in early America, you might run into starvation, you might die of thirst, you had problems with exposure, you might get too cold. They also had, of course, violence. You might die in battle or in violent situations. Medicine was so rudimentary that it was probably more dangerous to you than helpful to you. A simple infection might lead to death. Things that we just totally take for granted here in the modern age that we can easily deal with. Sudden death to us is something that is very out of the ordinary. It really catches us off guard. And yet we see many, many references in that 18th century time period, and that will happen to them, and they sort of take it in stride because it's happening so often. Maybe somebody like William Byrd, who's living in the early 18th century down in the Virginia area, and he talks about neighbors of his. He sees them one day, the next day, they're dead. Here's something that we deal with or hear about every day. Say we're in the shoes of someone in Europe in the 18th century and they want to come to North America. Now today, we'd hop on an airplane and we'd fly to Europe back and forth. People do it all the time and nobody's terribly concerned about dying on an airplane. Yes, we have airplane accidents, but really the number of deaths from airplane accidents is very, very small compared to the number of people traveling. But if you're in Europe and you want to come to North America, you have to travel by ocean in the 18th century. That trip might take 2 months, 3 months, hard to say. And many, many ships are sinking in that time period. It is dangerous to travel back and forth from Europe to North America. In addition to traveling on this fairly fragile vessel, we also have to deal with eating food that might kill us. You might get scurvy or something else. And disease on board ship, very, very dangerous. And not only are you willing to risk the travel, it's very common for people that are new to the New World from Europe to die of disease within the first 6 months. Why would someone take on these kinds of risks? Well, there were so many great opportunities in North America compared to what was going on in Europe. There was no place to grow, there was no place to go up, there was no new career in Europe. But North America was ripe with new things going on. So people were willing to take these kinds of risks. And some people did this travel because they were up against it. They had absolutely no choices. William Morley, in his 1720s memoir, talks about being in Great Britain. He was down on his luck. He was probably in his late teens, early 20s. Someone sees him. He's basically homeless and his clothes are raggedy. And they say, you know what? You should indenture yourself and go to the New World. And that's exactly what he does. He signs away 7 years of his labor so that he can travel to the New World to find anything, any kind of new career. Before the 7 years are up, he is able to return to England and try to reclaim his fortune there. It's hard to pinpoint exactly what the death rate was in the 18th century because they did not keep records the way we do today. But it's likely that the rate per thousand is about twice as much as it is today. So death was a common thing. But truly, in this time period, dying before you were 20 was the very most dangerous thing. Infant death mortality was something like 30% at times in certain places of Great Britain and North America during the 18th century time period. Not always that high, but at times very, very high compared to what it is today. If you got to 20 or 25 years of age, you'll probably live a fairly normal lifespan that we would guess today. You're going to live to be 60, 70, even 80 years old. A great example of this is Joseph Plum Martin. He lives to 89 years old, and yet he endured the most extremes of all these issues. He had to deal with severe problems with not having enough food when he was a soldier, not having enough water. Many times he had to deal with sleeping out in the elements, in the wintertime without even a blanket, just sleeping on the ground. He also had to endure battle. He also had to endure disease while he was in the army. And he was in different kinds of accidents that could easily have killed him. And yet, he lived to 89 years old. Another great example is Nicholas Creswell. He comes from Great Britain to North America in 1774. And he wants to seek his fortune. He wants to find a new life in North America. He endures the travel. He does get ill. He has a doctor see him and the doctor poisons him, almost kills him. To recover from that, he decides he's going to take another sea voyage. He's going to go down to the Caribbean, which of course known for its endemic diseases in the time period. Very dangerous place to go. He survives the trip back up to North America, and then he goes out into the frontier, a very dangerous and violent place to go. No medical care. He's going with very few food supplies. He's going in hostile territory. He gets injured when he's in the backwoods of Kentucky. He can't move for a couple of days. He comes back through more hostile territory, and he survives with no problem. He even goes back into the frontier one more time to sell his trade goods, and he survives that without any problem at all, even though he was going through very dangerous situations. Nicholas Creswell writes in 1774, "Confined to my room, sick of the bloody flux, I am in a most miserable condition, so weak I can scarcely get across the room, and afflicted with the most excruciating pain in my bowels. I believe my death is very fast approaching. I am wholly resigned to the will of heaven and submit to my fate without repining." If we were back in time, would we be able to survive all the diseases that they had to deal with in the 18th century? There were endemic and epidemic disease problems in North America in the 18th century. There were places in, especially the southern colonies, that were just ripe with disease. People would just die in certain seasons of the year because there were common things like malaria. And then, even in Philadelphia, they had problems with epidemic diseases that would come in, especially through the seaports. And there were times when they would have yellow fever problems, and large quantities of the population would die. And one of the biggest killers, smallpox. In a lot of these cases, the medical industry really didn't have much of an answer for this. They just had to grin and bear it. They watched this, they wanted to know what was happening with this, but they didn't have any real cures for it. Luckily, something like smallpox, they did come up with ways to inoculate people, but even that was very dangerous. This seems like an impossible life with all these difficulties: the disease, the food, the thirst, the exposure, and yet we have the example of something like the Lewis and Clark expedition. 25 men, however many men it was, a 2-year expedition into unexplored, hostile territory. They had to travel by water, then they had to walk over mountains, and they were in just terrible difficulties. One person died on that expedition. One man, he died of appendicitis, basically almost right after they left. He would have died whether he was on the expedition or at home. All these men, all the rest of these men came home alive. So, could we survive in early North America? Well, if we could get through that infant mortality phase, and that was difficult, that was rich and poor alike that had that problem. If we could get to, say, 20 years old, well, I think we had a pretty good chance, especially if we were hardened like they were. Now, they lived in hard times. It was a difficult world to survive in, and so they were trained for that. They didn't really have any choice. Another question to ask is, did they even know they were living in dangerous times? Well, compared to hundreds of years earlier, they probably thought they were living in the best of times. I'm sure they thought they had it easy compared to, say, medieval peasants or people from even earlier times. So obviously none of us are going to have to go back in time and endure the 18th century and try to have to survive. The question is, how do we use that information for us today? And there's a lot to learn from the people in the 18th century. So many of those people did travel across those oceans and endure those difficulties. And so many families did leave the easy life on the coast and go into the frontier. They took on those challenges, even though it was difficult. We need to take on the challenges that today gives us. We need to cross those oceans, metaphorically. We need to go into the frontier, or whatever that is, to build a better future for ourselves and for the people after us. What is a feast to a poor hunter? Is it an entire buffalo? Is it a loaf of bread? Or is it a full belly and a successful hunt? One of the most difficult and dangerous jobs in the 18th century was that of the professional hunter. He had to endure an environment that was against him. He had to survive off of his surroundings. He had to be able to fix any of his equipment. At any point, he might become injured, get sick, run out of supplies. He might even die. Today, I want a victory for this poor hunter. We are going to make him a feast. There's an amazing time period between 1760 and about 1775 where there are lots of long hunters, professional hunters out in the deep frontier, and they are collecting, they're harvesting deer and beaver hides specifically for export to Europe. The industry was certainly around 100 years before this, but all through that time period, it was done by Native Americans. It wasn't until we get to about 1760 where there is a generation of people that have grown up in North America that have the skills to go out into the frontier to do this kind of hunting. It is not easy to do. In fact, it is full of difficulties. Now, we certainly have hunting today, and most of the hunting is going on as a recreation. Or possibly some people use it to fill their freezer with food. That is certainly going on in the 18th century. Plenty of people are using wild game to put food on the table. But the professional hunters we're talking about here are not necessarily going for food. They're going for the hides of the animals. And they are spending not weeks or a day out in the woods, but months. In fact, an entire year out in the woods trying to harvest as many deer and beaver hides as possible. This hunting is going on east of the Mississippi. There are lots of different kinds of game in the woods. You could probably think of the king of the forest in that time period, even east of the Mississippi, was the buffalo, the bison. There are lots of bison, not as many as there would be west of the Mississippi, where there are giant herds, tens of thousands of buffalo. For the professional hunter, you might think this would be the most sought after animal, but it turns out that the hides were not very valuable. Buffalo can be very, very difficult to kill. You couldn't use the hides for sale. You might use the hides for other purposes. You might use them for creating coverings for your deer hide that you are selling, but you're not generally going out and hunting lots of buffalo unless you're starving. And of course, the frontier is filled with other kinds of wild game, bear and elk. Again, both very useful, but they aren't the cash crop. They're not the one you're really going after so that you can take something back from the frontier to the civilized areas and make a lot of money. We do have situations where people are processing bison, maybe even salting it and sending it to Fort Pitt. But if it's gonna go out east and it's meat, well, venison's probably much better. But again, the cash crop is the hide. Hundreds of thousands of hides are being shipped off every year to Europe for processing. This is the most valuable product these hunters can come back to civilization with. Probably the most famous long hunter name is Daniel Boone, the kind of person who grew up in this area and had the kinds of skills that it took to survive for months and months at a time and live off the land. The main dish today is tongue. It's a very interesting cut of meat. There are times in our 18th century context where if you're going to take any particular piece of meat off an animal, then you're going to take the very best. The tongue being the very best cut of meat off of the buffalo, it's a win for the long hunter. It's a little interesting to prepare, at least in this kind of primitive cooking situation. We need to sear the tongue to get the skin to come off of it. Many times if we're cooking a tongue today, we will poach it or boil it and then be able to take the skin off the outer side. It's not so easy here by the campfire. We're just gonna put it really close to the fire and get it to dry a little bit so we can peel it off. And then we're just going to put it on a wooden stake and roast it over the fire. This was written in 1779. First scorch the tongue a little, then peel off the outside coating, then stick it on a spit made of spice bush with the lower end in the ground. If no spice bush is at hand, a sassafras branch works just as well. So what did one of these hunting expeditions look like? It was lasting, again, months, not weeks, not days, months or even a year, possibly even longer. If you're going to be bringing lots of things out of the frontier, you have to have some way to carry that. Someone's going to have a minimum of 3 or 4 pack horses, possibly many more. Because you want to come out with as many hides as possible. It's the only way for your trip to be profitable at all. And these expeditions aren't just a single person. You're going into a very, very dangerous environment. There are times when you have to defend yourself, and so you really can't do that with one person. So they're going out in larger groups, 3 and 4, maybe a half a dozen or a dozen men. You've got a camp, or a camp at least for a while. You might have to move from one spot to the other as you're hunting. You're going to have a half shelter like this, and you're again killing a lot of deer or beaver. Those animals have to be butchered, their skin has to be taken off, and then has to be processed. You can't just take a raw hide with you. You have to sort of half tan them so that you can pack them up and ship them out. And they have to last for months. You know, the ones you kill at the beginning have to last until you're ready to come out of the frontier. So it is a very dirty, nasty, hard job. It is all day long. You're going out hunting, you're bringing back the animals, you're processing, and starting out again. Spit made of spice bush with the lower end in the ground. If no spice bush is at hand, a sassafras branch works just as well. So what did one of these hunting expeditions look like? It was lasting, again, months, not weeks, not days, months or even a year, possibly even longer. If you're going to be bringing lots of things out of the frontier, you have to have some way to carry that. Someone's going to have a minimum of 3 or 4 pack horses, possibly many more. Because you want to come out with as many hides as possible. It's the only way for your trip to be profitable at all. And these expeditions aren't just a single person. You're going into a very, very dangerous environment. There are times when you have to defend yourself, and so you really can't do that with one person. So they're going out in larger groups, 3 and 4, maybe a half a dozen or a dozen men. You've got a camp, or a camp at least for a while. You might have to move from one spot to the other as you're hunting. You're going to have a half shelter like this, and you're again killing a lot of deer or beaver. Those animals have to be butchered, their skin has to be taken off, and then has to be processed. You can't just take a raw hide with you. You have to sort of half tan them so that you can pack them up and ship them out. And they have to last for months. You know, the ones you kill at the beginning have to last until you're ready to come out of the frontier. So it is a very dirty, nasty, hard job. It is all day long. You're going out hunting, you're bringing back the animals, you're processing, and starting out again the next day. There's a clash of cultures going on here, with the hunters coming off of the coast, and then we've got Native Americans. And the Native Americans here, they're not a monolith. You have different tribes, and sometimes they're at war with each other. At the same time, they're basically at war with these long hunters. So it is an incredibly dangerous spot to be. But it's not just people that you have to worry about. You have to worry about bears. You have to worry about mountain lions. You have to worry about buffalo. They're very dangerous animals to interact with, as well as something like elk. You're so deep in this forest that you're weeks away from resupply of just about anything. If your equipment breaks, you have to be able to fix it. And the most important thing to these hunters was their gun. That's a complicated piece of equipment in our 18th century situation. And you've got nothing but a campfire and maybe a very small hammer and a little hand vise to fix anything that might break. Another delicacy for these long hunters is bone marrow, and it's sort of the opposite of tongue. Tongue is a very easy thing to harvest from an animal. The bone marrow can be very difficult to harvest from the animal, so you've got to carve all the meat away to get to the bones. And you have to have a very large bone to get any decent marrow out of it. But the bones that were roasted, the marrow would soften up and they could scoop it out and spread it on bread or Johnny cakes for that very, very special flavor. I was trying to think of a comparison that we would have today, a job that we could do today that would be anything similar to what was happening with these 18th century hunters. Maybe you've seen the show Deadliest Catch. You're out there on the seas for months at a time. Or maybe the job of somebody on an oil rig. Again, away from civilization for months at a time, no real connection. These people usually have all their supplies along with them. The hunters, on the other hand, they were living on the environment for all that time. There are many times on the channel where we've talked about people in the 18th century using every little bit of something, so not letting anything go to waste. The hunters here are in a situation that many times is just the opposite. They are in a land of bounty. There are times when there is way more meat than anyone could possibly eat, and they'll just take little bits of an animal, the very, very best parts, and the rest they will just leave to rot. And yet, 3 or 4 days later, they're out of anything to eat and they are starving. This feast or famine situation is not with just these 18th century long hunters. It's happening with the Native Americans who are doing the same kind of hunting. When the hides are the cash crop, it doesn't matter whether they're Native Americans or these 18th century hunters, the meat part is not important, and so it just goes to waste. Johnny cakes would be another win for our long hunter. Ground corn, maize, that's something that they can bring along with them to the frontier. They might not want to use very much at a time because you can only bring so much. But that's that last little flavor of home that you can bring along with you. It's very easy to cook, and it has that amazing flavor that you're missing once you're out on this frontier for months and months at a time. This would be a line of work for a very special kind of person. Somebody who was able to live off the land for months at a time. Someone who's able to hunt and harvest animals by the hundreds if need be. Someone who is able to fix their own equipment. Somebody who's able to fight off bears and mountain lions and buffalo. He was somebody who could handle the pressure of living in this kind of environment. This is the Poor Hunter's Feast, and it is very good. What is a feast to a poor prisoner? Is it a heaping bowl of gruel? Is it a lobster straight from the sea? Or is it bread and water, just enough to get you through the night? Prisons in the 18th century are one of the most grueling subjects we can study. I want a victory for this poor prisoner. We are going to make him a feast. I want to understand the real history of the 18th and early 19th century. And if we want to understand society in that time period, we have to know what they did with people who broke the rules. That is crime and punishment. What happens in the 18th and early 19th century is completely different than what happens today. Almost diametrically opposed to what we do today. Today, we do a lot of incarcerating people. We put them in prison for periods of time to punish them and to rehabilitate them. But that does not happen generally in the 18th century. People are punished for breaking the rules by fining them. They might whip them. They might put them in a pillory, in the stocks. They might transport someone, send them to a whole nother place, maybe America in the 18th century and in the 19th century to Australia. And they would also just plain execute them. That idea of rehabilitating somebody doesn't exist until we get to about 1800, and then there is a complete sea change. What does prison look like? Who is in prison in the 18th century? Well, people awaiting trial. Sometimes witnesses have to be held in prison in the 18th century. We have debtors being held in prison, and there's some fascinating studies about what's happening with debtors in the 18th century. They also have workhouses. Poor people who are destitute, they are put into a prison-like situation. And related to this, we have prisoners of war. How they treat prisoners of war in the 18th century starts to bleed into and change the way they treat regular civilian prisoners also. A perfect example of this is what happens with prisoners of war during the American Revolution. The British started to hold American POWs in hulks, or decommissioned ships. They started to use this idea a few decades later in Great Britain, and they had prison hulks for regular civilian prisoners. They did this because they needed prisons quickly. They couldn't transport people away to North America anymore. It takes a long time to build a prison, and so they had these old ships. They could turn them into an instant prison. They were very hard to escape from, and they held people very well. There are two main drivers of this change from how we're punishing prisoners in this late 18th century time period. And one of those is really kind of driven by Quakers, especially in Pennsylvania. They had an idea that maybe this corporal punishment, the idea of executing prisoners or deporting prisoners, that they didn't think worked very well. They had the idea that they could rehabilitate prisoners, that they could punish them in a prison setting, maybe giving them very small quantities of food, maybe holding them in solitary confinement, that this would change their idea and make them into better people. And also in Great Britain, we have this problem of them no longer being able to deport or export their prisoners. And so they had to have a different way of dealing with them. So they started to hold them for longer terms in the prison ships and in prisons that they built. But how are these prisoners treated? How are they fed? That's what we're looking for here. What are prisoners eating? That can be very, very different in so many different settings. Earlier on in the 18th century, before we get to the idea of the punishment concept, and we're just holding people in prison, well, most people are held in county jails awaiting their trial. And if that's happening, then they're fed with basically whatever they can afford. Most people come in with a little bit of money, and the jailers are feeding them, saying, well, you know, we're not going to give you a ration. You're going to have to pay for your own food. So if you were rich in prison, you could eat as much as you want. And if you were poor, you might not have anything. Maybe a little bit of charity would come in, and they would feed prisoners who didn't have any way of feeding themselves. It is very ad hoc. It's very, very changeable in that early 18th century context. As we move on and we're going to put people in prison as a punishment, then food starts to change a lot. And people can't buy themselves anything they want. The rules change and they say, no, you have to deal with just the prison ration that you're given. Sometimes there's some flexibility there. There's certain prisons where each prisoner is given a ration of bread, maybe even something like hardtack, and then 1 penny a day. And they can spend that penny on, well, whatever meat or other kind of food that they want for that particular day. And in some prisons, they had a sutler, a single person who was in charge of that kind of meat or other kinds of foodstuffs. And that was very highly regulated so that the prisoners weren't cheated. They created this system because earlier on in the 18th century, jailers were known to steal whatever they could from the people under their care. They were in charge of their food, and so they could charge as high a price as they liked. Food is part of the punishment. At times, nothing but bread and water. That is the ration, and probably not that much bread. In fact, there is a study that was done. They were experimenting on the prisoners in Great Britain in the 1820s, and they said, these prisoners are getting too much food. Let's keep lowering and lowering the ration until we see what they can survive upon. And it was a couple of years into that experiment, and they had to call it off. Too many people were dying, and I guess they decided that maybe that wasn't a humane thing to do. Again, prisoners of war are kind of leading the way in this prison situation, and prisoners of war were given a standard military ration, but lower. So because they weren't working, people that were in charge of the prison figured that a prisoner of war could survive on maybe 2/3 or half of what a regular soldier would get. In theory, they were supposed to get that ration every single day. Now, the reality is I don't think anybody ever got what the rules said they were going to get. Here are the rations set down by the state of Pennsylvania. And we have Sunday, 1 pound of bread, 1 pound of coarse meat made into a broth. Monday, 1 pound of bread, 1 quart of potatoes. Tuesday, 1 quart of Indian meal made into mush. And then Wednesday, we get the bread and the potatoes. Thursday, the cornmeal again into mush. Friday, we have bread and potatoes. Saturday, we have the Indian meal into mush. So just 1 day a week, you've got something with meat in it, and the rest of the time is just a simple bread and potatoes or cornmeal mush. We also have some documentation for New York in 1800. This is the food for 250 prisoners. For breakfast, a peck of rye, 6.5 quarts of molasses, 130 pounds of rye and Indian bread, and then the fuel for cooking it. They have that as part of their budget. For dinner or lunch, 17 ox hearts, 7 ox heads, 6 lamb plucks, that would be like the guts, 1 peck of potatoes, 3 pounds of Indian meal, some salt, a little bit of pepper, and then 110 pounds of bread, maybe that's soft bread or hard bread, and some herbs. So they'd probably make one big sort of stew out of that, again for about 250 people. And then for supper at night, 36 pounds of Indian meal for mush, a little bit of salt, 61 pounds of bread, a little bit of molasses. That's it. It is painful to read many of these prison accounts. The prisoners at times were held in community, basically all in one giant room. And they would be given their food ration, or they would be given charitable clothing, and they would gamble these things away. And then they would be left in the most destitute situations. If we take all that we've learned here today and put it all together, I think we can make a feast for our prisoner. Now, if we look at this 1800 New York description of what they're feeding their prisoners, they take very, very inexpensive meat. So ox hearts,